Young America in Literature by Herman Melville. Chapter 1. Among the various conflicting modes of writing history, there would seem to be two grand practical distinctions, under which all the rest must subordinately range. By the one mode, all contemporaneous circumstances, facts, and events must be set down contemporaneously. By the other, they are only to be set down as the general stream of the narrative shall dictate, for matters which are kindred in time may be very irrelative in themselves. I elect neither of these. I am careless of either. Both are well enough in their way. I write precisely as I please. In the earlier chapters of this volume, it has somewhere been passingly intimated that Pierre was not only a reader of the poets and other fine writers, but likewise, and what is a very different thing from the other, a thorough allegorical understander of them, a profound emotional sympathizer with them. In other words, Pierre himself possessed the poetic nature, in himself absolutely, though but latently and floatingly, possessed every whit of the imaginative wealth which he so admired, when, by vast painstakings and all manner of unrecompensed agonies, systematized on the printed page. Not that as yet his young and immature soul had been accosted by the wonderful mutes, and through the vast halls of silent truth had been ushered into the full, secret, eternally inviolable Sanhedrim, where the poetic magi discuss, in glorious gibberish, the Alpha and Omega of the universe. But among the beautiful imaginings of the second and third degree of poets, he freely and comprehendingly ranged. But it still remains to be said that Pierre himself had written many a fugitive thing, which had brought him not only vast credit and compliments from his more immediate acquaintances, but the less partial applauses of the always intelligent and extremely discriminating public. In short, Pierre had frequently done that which many other boys have done, published. Not in the imposing form of a book, but in the more modest and becoming way of occasional contributions to magazines and other polite periodicals. His magnificent and victorious debut had been made in that delightful love sonnet, entitled The Tropical Summer. Not only the public had applauded his gemmed little sketches of thought and fancy, whether in poetry or prose, but the high and mighty Campbell clan of editors of all sorts had bestowed upon him those generous commendations, which, with one instantaneous glance, they had immediately perceived was his due. They spoke in high terms of his surprising command of language. They begged to express their wonder at his euphonious construction of sentences. They regarded with reverence the pervading symmetry of his general style. But transcending even this profound insight into the deep merits of Pierre, they looked infinitely beyond, and confessed their complete inability to restrain their unqualified admiration for the highly judicious smoothness and genteelness of the sentiments and fancies expressed. This writer, said one, in an ungovernable burst of admiring fury, is characterized throughout by perfect taste. Another, after endorsingly quoting that sapient, suppressed maxim of Dr. Goldsmith's, which asserts that whatever is new is false, went on to apply it to the excellent productions before him, concluding with this: he has translated the unruffled gentleman from the drawing-room into the general levee of letters. He never permits himself to astonish, is never betrayed into anything coarse or new, as assured that whatever astonishes is vulgar, and whatever is new must be crude. Yes, it is the glory of this admirable young author, that vulgarity and vigor, two inseparable adjuncts, are equally removed from him. A third perorated a long and beautifully written review, by the bold and startling announcement: this writer is unquestionably a highly respectable youth. Nor had the editors of various moral and religious periodicals failed to render the tribute of their severer appreciation, and more enviable, because more chary applause. A renowned clerical and philological conductor of a weekly publication of this kind, whose surprising proficiency in the Greek, Hebrew, and Chaldaic, to which he had devoted by far the greater part of his life, peculiarly fitted him to pronounce unerring judgment upon works of taste in the English, had unhesitatingly delivered himself thus: he is blameless in morals and harmless throughout. Another had unhesitatingly recommended his effusions to the family circle. A third had no reserve in saying that the predominant end and aim of this author was evangelical piety. A mind less naturally strong than Pierre's might well have been hurried into vast self-complacency by such eulogy as this, especially as there could be no possible doubt that the primitive verdict pronounced by the editors was irreversible, except in the highly improbable event of the near approach of the millennium, which might establish a different dynasty of taste and possibly eject the editors. It is true that in view of the general practical vagueness of these panegyrics and the circumstance that, in essence, they were all somehow of the prudently indecisive sort, and, considering that they were panegyrics and nothing but panegyrics, without anything analytical about them, an elderly friend of a literary turn had made bold to say to our hero, "Pierre, this is very high praise, I grant, and you are a surprisingly young author to receive it, but I do not see any criticisms as yet." "Criticisms?" cried Pierre in amazement. "Why, sir, they are all criticisms. I am the idol of the critics." "Ah," sighed the elderly friend, as if suddenly reminded that that was true after all. "Ah," and went on with his inoffensive, noncommittal cigar. Nevertheless, thanks to the editors, such at last became the popular literary enthusiasm in behalf of Pierre, that two young men, recently abandoning the ignoble pursuit of tailoring for the more honorable trade of the publisher, probably with an economical view of working up in books the linen and cotton shreds of the cutter's counter, after having been subjected to the action of the paper mill, had on the daintiest scalloped-edged paper and in the neatest possible and fine needlework hand, addressed him a letter, couched in the following terms, the general style of which letter will sufficiently evince that, though, thanks to the manufacturer, their linen and cotton shreds may have been very completely transmuted into paper, yet the cutters themselves were not yet entirely out of the metamorphosing mill. Honorable Pierre Glendinning, revered Sir, the fine cut, the judicious fit of your productions fill us with amazement. The fabric is excellent, the finest broadcloth of genius. We have just started in business. Your pantaloons, productions we mean, have never yet been collected. They should be published in the library form. The tailors, we mean the librarians, demand it. Your fame is now in its finest nap. Now, before the gloss is off, now is the time for the library form. We have recently received an invoice of chamois, Russia leather. The library form should be a durable form. We respectfully offer to dress your amazing productions in the library form. If you please, we will transmit you a sample of the cloth. We mean a sample page with a pattern of the leather. We are ready to give you 1/10 of the profits, less discount, for the privilege of arraying your wonderful productions in the library form, you cashing the seamstresses, printers and binders' bills on the day of publication. An answer at your earliest convenience will greatly oblige. Sir, your most obsequious servants, Wonder and One. P.S. We respectfully submit the enclosed block sheet as some earnest of our intentions to do everything in your behalf possible to any firm in the trade. N.B. If the list does not comprise all your illustrious wardrobe works, we mean, we shall exceedingly regret it. We have hunted through all the drawers, magazines, sample of a coat, title for the works of Glendinning, the complete works of Glendinning, author of that world-famed production, The Tropical Summer, a sonnet, The Weather, a thought, Life, an impromptu, the late Reverend Mark Graceman, an obituary, Honor, a stanza, Beauty, an acrostic, Edgar, an anagram, The Pippin, a paragraph, and C, 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 and C. P. From a designer, Pierre had received the following. Sir, I approach you with unfeigned trepidation. For though you are young in age, you are old in fame and ability. I cannot express to you my ardent admiration of your works, nor can I but deeply regret that the productions of such graphic descriptive power should be unaccompanied by the humbler illustrative labors of the designer. My services in this line are entirely at your command. I need not say how proud I should be if this hint on my part, however presuming, should induce you to reply in terms upon which I could found the hope of honoring myself and my profession by a few designs for the works of the illustrious Glendinning. But the cursory mention of your name here fills me with such swelling emotions that I can say nothing more. I would only add, however, that not being at all connected with the trade, my business situation unpleasantly forces me to make cash down on delivery of each design, the basis of all my professional arrangements. Your noble soul, however, would disdain to suppose that this sordid necessity in my merely business concerns could ever impair that profound private veneration and admiration with which I unmercenarily am, great and good Glendinning, yours most humbly, Peter Pence. Chapter 2. These were stirring letters. The library form. An illustrated edition. His whole heart swelled. But unfortunately it occurred to Pierre that as all his writings were not only fugitive, but if put together could not possibly fill more than a very small duodecimo. Therefore the library edition seemed a little premature, perhaps, possibly, in a slight degree, preposterous. Then, as they were chiefly made up of little sonnets, brief meditative poems, and moral essays, the matter for the designer ran some small risk of being but meager. In his inexperience, he did not know that such was the great height of invention to which the designer's art had been carried, that certain gentlemen of that profession had gone to an eminent publishing house with overtures for an illustrated edition of Coke upon Littleton. Even the city directory was beautifully illustrated with exquisite engravings of bricks, tongs, and flat-irons. Concerning the draft for the title page, it must be confessed that on seeing the imposing enumeration of his titles, long and magnificent as those preceding the proclamations of some German prince, hereditary lord of the backyard of Krantz Jacobi, undoubted proprietor by seizure of the bedstead of the late widow Van Lorne, heir apparent to the bankrupt bakery of Fletz and Flitz, residuary legatee of the confiscated pin money of the late Dowager Dunker, and C. Pierre could not entirely repress a momentary feeling of elation. Yet did he also bow low under the weight of his own ponderosity, as the author of such a vast load of literature. It occasioned him some slight misgivings, however, when he considered that already in his 18th year, his title page should so immensely surpass in voluminous statisticals the simple page, which in his father's edition prefixed the vast speculations of Plato. Still, he comforted himself with the thought that as he could not presume to interfere with the bill stickers of the Gazelle magazine, who every month covered the walls of the city with gigantic announcements of his name among the other contributors, so neither could he now, in the highly improbable event of closing with the offer of Messrs. Wonder and Wynne, presume to interfere with the bill-sticking department of their business concern, for it was plain that they esteemed one's title page but another unwindowed wall, infinitely more available than most walls, since here was at least one spot in the city where no rival bill stickers dared to encroach. Nevertheless, resolved as he was to let all such bill-sticking matters take care of themselves, he was sensible of some coy inclination toward that modest method of certain kid-gloved and dainty authors, who, scorning the vulgarity of a sounding parade, contented themselves with simply subscribing their name to the title page, as confident that that was sufficient guarantee to the notice of all true gentlemen of taste. It was for petty German princes to sound their prolonged titular flourishes. The Tsar of Russia contented himself with putting the simple word Nicholas to his loftiest decrees. This train of thought terminated at last in various considerations upon the subject of anonymousness in authorship. He regretted that he had not started his literary career under that mask. At present, it might be too late. Already the whole universe knew him, and it was in vain at this late day to attempt to hood himself. But when he considered the essential dignity and propriety at all points of the inviolably anonymous method, he could not but feel the sincerest sympathy for those unfortunate fellows who, not only naturally averse to any sort of publicity, but progressively ashamed of their own successive productions, written chiefly for the merest cash, were yet cruelly coerced into sounding title pages by sundry bakers' and butchers' bills and other financial considerations, inasmuch as the placard of the title page indubitably must assist the publisher in his sales. But perhaps the ruling, though not altogether conscious motive of Pierre in finally declining, as he did, The services of Messrs. Wonder and Wynne, those eager applicants for the privilege of extending and solidifying his fame, arose from the idea that being at this time not very far advanced in years, the probability was that his future productions might at least equal, if not surpass, in some small degree, those already given to the world. He resolved to wait for his literary canonization until he should at least have outgrown the sophomorean insinuation of the law, which, with a singular affectation of benignity, pronounced him an infant. His modesty obscured from him the circumstance that the greatest lettered celebrities of the time had, by the divine power of genius, become full graduates in the University of Fame, while yet as legal minors forced to go to their mammas for pennies wherewith to keep them in peanuts. Not seldom Pierre's social placidity was ruffled by polite entreaties from the young ladies that he would be pleased to grace their albums with some nice little song. We say that here his social placidity was ruffled, for the true charm of agreeable parlor society is that there you lose your own sharp individuality and become delightfully merged in that soft social pantheism, as it were, that rosy melting of all into one, ever prevailing in those drawing-rooms, which pacifically and deliciously belie their own name, inasmuch as there no one draws the sword of his own individuality, but all such ugly weapons are left, as of old, with your hat and cane in the hall. It was very awkward to decline the albums, but somehow it was still worse, and peculiarly distasteful for Pierre to comply. With equal justice apparently, you might either have called this his weakness or his idiosyncrasy. He summoned all his suavity and refused. And the refusal of Pierre, according to Miss Angelica Amabilia of Ambleside, was sweeter than the compliance of others. But then, prior to the proffer of her album, in a copse at Ambleside, Pierre in a gallant whim had in the lady's own presence voluntarily carved Miss Angelica's initials upon the bark of a beautiful maple. But all young ladies are not Miss Angelicas. Blandly denied in the parlor, they courted repulse in the study. In lovely envelopes they dispatched their albums to Pierre, not omitting to drop a little attar of rose in the palm of the domestic who carried them. While now Pierre, pushed to the wall in his gallantry, shilly-shallied as to what he must do, the awaiting albums multiplied upon him, and by monopolized an entire shelf in his chamber, so that while their combined ornate bindings fairly dazzled his eyes, their excessive redolence all but made him to faint, though indeed, in moderation, he was very partial to perfumes. So that of really chilly afternoons, he was still obliged to drop the upper sashes a few inches. The simplest of all things it is to write in a lady's album. But cui bono? Is there such a dearth of printed reading that the monkish times must be revived, and ladies' books be in manuscript? What could Pierre write of his own on love, or anything else, that would surpass what divine Hafiz wrote so many long centuries ago? Was there not Anacreon too, and Catullus and Ovid, all translated and readily accessible? And then, bless all their souls, had the dear creatures forgotten Talmor? But the handwriting, Pierre, they want the sight of your hand. Well, thought Pierre, actual feeling is better than transmitted sight, any day. I will give them the actual feeling of my hand, as much as they want. And lips are still better than hands. Let them send their sweet faces to me, and I will kiss lipographs upon them forever and a day. This was a felicitous idea. He called dates, and had the albums carried down by the basketful into the dining room. He opened and spread them all out upon the extension table there. Then, modeling himself by the Pope, when His Holiness collectively blesses long crates of rosaries, he waved one devout kiss to the albums, and summoning 3 servants sent the albums all home, with his best compliments, accompanied with a confectioner's kiss for each album, rolled up in the most ethereal tissue. From various quarters of the land, both town and country, and especially during the preliminary season of autumn, Pierre received various pressing invitations to lecture before lyceums, young men's associations, and other literary and scientific societies. The letters conveying these invitations possessed quite an imposing and most flattering aspect to the unsophisticated Pierre. One was as follows: a Cartean club for the immediate extension of the limits of all knowledge, both human and divine. Zadok Prattsville, June 11th, 18. Author of The Tropical Summer and C. Honored and dear sir, official duty and private inclination in this present case most delightfully blend. What was the ardent desire of my heart has now by the action of the Committee on Lectures become professionally obligatory upon me. As chairman of our Committee on Lectures, I hereby beg the privilege of entreating that you will honor this society by lecturing before it on any subject you may choose, and at any day most convenient to yourself. The subject of human destiny we would respectfully suggest, without however at all wishing to impede you in your own unbiased selection. If you honor us by complying with this invitation, be assured, sir, that the Committee on Lectures will take the best care of you throughout your stay and endeavor to make Zadoc-Prattsville agreeable to you. A carriage will be in attendance at the stage house to convey yourself and luggage to the inn, under full escort of the Committee on Lectures, with the chairman at their head. Permit me to join my private homage to my high official consideration for you, and to subscribe myself, very humbly your servant, Donald Dundonald. Chapter 3. But it was more especially the lecture invitations coming from venerable, gray-headed metropolitan societies, and indeed by venerable gray-headed secretaries, which far from elating filled the youthful Pierre with the sincerest sense of humility. Lecture? Lecture? Such a stripling as I lecture to 50 benches, with 10 gray heads on each. 500 gray heads in all. Shall my one, poor, inexperienced brain presume to lay down the law in a lecture to 500 life-ripened understandings? It seemed too absurd for thought. Yet the 500, through their spokesman, had voluntarily extended this identical invitation to him. Then how could it be otherwise than that an incipient Timonism should slide into Pierre when he considered all the disgraceful inferences to be derived from such a fact? He called to mind how that once upon a time, during a visit of his to the city, the police were called out to quell a portentous riot, occasioned by the vast press and contention for seats at the first lecture of an illustrious lad of 19, the author of A Week at Coney Island. It is needless to say that Pierre most conscientiously and respectfully declined all polite overtures of this sort. Similar disenchantments of his cooler judgment did likewise deprive of their full lusciousness several other equally marked demonstrations of his literary celebrity. Applications for autographs showered in upon him, but in sometimes humorously gratifying the more urgent requests of these singular people, Pierre could not but feel a pang of regret that, owing to the very youthful and quite unformed character of his handwriting, his signature did not possess that inflexible uniformity which, for mere prudential reasons if nothing more, should always mark the hand of illustrious men. His heart thrilled with sympathetic anguish for posterity, which would be certain to stand hopelessly perplexed before so many contradictory signatures of one supereminent name. Alas! Posterity would be sure to conclude that they were forgeries all, that no chirographic relic of the sublime poet Glendinning survived to their miserable times. From the proprietors of the magazines whose pages were honored by his effusions, he received very pressing epistolary solicitations for the loan of his portrait in oil, in order to take an engraving therefrom for a frontispiece to their periodicals. But here again the most melancholy considerations obtruded. It had always been one of the lesser ambitions of Pierre to sport a flowing beard, which he deemed the most noble corporeal badge of the man, not to speak of the illustrious author. But as yet he was beardless, and no cunning compound of Roland and Son could force a beard which should arrive at maturity in any reasonable time for the frontispiece. Besides, his boyish features and whole expression were daily changing. Would he lend his authority to this unprincipled imposture upon posterity? Honor forbade. These epistolary petitions were generally couched in an elaborately respectful style, thereby intimating with what deep reverence his portrait would be handled, while unavoidably subjected to the discipline indispensable to obtain from it the engraved copy they prayed for. But one or two of the persons who made occasional oral requisitions upon him in this matter of his engraved portrait seemed less regardful of the inherent respect due to every man's portrait, much more to that of a genius so celebrated as Pierre. They did not even seem to remember that the portrait of any man generally receives, and indeed is entitled to more reverence than the original man himself, since one may freely clap a celebrated friend on the shoulder, yet would by no means tweak his nose in his portrait. The reason whereof may be this, that the portrait is better entitled to reverence than the man, inasmuch as nothing belittling can be imagined concerning the portrait, whereas many unavoidably belittling things can be fancied as touching the man. Upon one occasion, happening suddenly to encounter a literary acquaintance, a joint editor of the Captain Kidd Monthly, who suddenly popped upon him round a corner, Pierre was startled by a rapid, good morning, just the man I wanted. Come, step round now with me, and have your daguerreotype taken. Get it engraved then in no time. Want it for the next issue." So saying, this chief mate of Captain Kidd seized Pierre's arm, and in the most vigorous manner was walking him off, like an officer a pickpocket, when Pierre civilly said, "Pray, sir, hold, if you please, I shall do no such thing." Pooh, must have it, public property, come along. Only a door or two now." "Public property," rejoined Pierre, "that may do very well for the Captain Kidd Monthly. It's very Captain Kiddish to say so. But I beg to repeat that I do not intend to exceed." "Don't? Really?" cried the other, amazedly staring Pierre full in the countenance. "Why, bless your soul, my portrait is published, long ago published." "Can't help that, sir," said Pierre.
"Oh."
Come along, and the chief mate seized him again with the most uncompunctious familiarity by the arm. Though the sweetest-tempered youth in the world when but decently treated, Pierre had an ugly devil in him sometimes, very apt to be evoked by the personal profaneness of gentlemen of the Captain Kidd School of Literature. "Look you, my good fellow," said he, submitting to his impartial inspection a determinately double fist, "drop my arm now, or I'll drop you. To the devil with you and your daguerreotype." This incident, suggestive as it was at the time, in the sequel had a surprising effect upon Pierre. For he considered with what infinite readiness now the most faithful portrait of anyone could be taken by the daguerreotype, whereas in former times a faithful portrait was only within the power of the moneyed or mental aristocrats of the earth. How natural then the inference, that instead, as in old times, immortalizing a genius, a portrait now only dialyzed a dunce. Besides, when everybody has his portrait published, true distinction lies in not having yours published at all. For if you are published along with Tom, Dick, and Harry and wear a coat of their cut, how then are you distinct from Tom, Dick, and Harry? Therefore, even so miserable a motive as downright personal vanity helped to operate in this matter with Pierre. Some zealous lovers of the general literature of the age, as well as declared devotees to his own great genius, frequently petitioned him for the materials wherewith to frame his biography. They assured him that life of all things was most insecure. He might feel many years in him yet, time might go lightly by him, but in any sudden and fatal sickness, how would his last hours be embittered by the thought that he was about to depart forever, leaving the world utterly unprovided with the knowledge of what were the precise texture and hue of the first trozens he wore. These representations did certainly touch him in a very tender spot, not previously unknown to the schoolmaster. But when Pierre considered that owing to his extreme youth, his own recollections of the past soon merged into all manner of half-memories and a general vagueness, he could not find it in his conscience to present such materials to the impatient biographers, especially as his chief verifying authority in these matters of his past career was now eternally departed beyond all human appeal. His excellent nurse Clarissa had been dead 4 years and more. In vain a young literary friend, the well-known author of 2 indexes and 1 epic, to whom the subject happened to be mentioned, warmly espoused the cause of the distressed biographers, saying that however unpleasant, one must needs pay the penalty of celebrity, it was no use to stand back, and concluded by taking from the crown of his hat the proof-sheets of his own biography, which, with the most thoughtful consideration for the masses, was shortly to be published in the pamphlet form, price only a shilling. It only the more bewildered and pained him when still other and less delicate applicants sent him their regularly printed biographico-solicito circulars, with his name written in ink, begging him to honor them and the world with a neat draft of his life, including criticisms on his own writings, the printed circular indiscriminately protesting that undoubtedly he knew more of his own life than any other living man, and that only he who had put together the great works of Glendinning could be fully qualified thoroughly to analyze them and cast the ultimate judgment upon their remarkable construction. Now, it was under the influence of the humiliating emotions engendered by things like the above. It was when thus haunted by publishers, engravers, editors, critics, autograph collectors, portrait fanciers, biographers, and petitioning and remonstrating literary friends of all sorts. It was then that there stole into the youthful soul of Pierre melancholy forebodings of the utter unsatisfactoriness of all human fame, since the most ardent profferings of the most martyrizing demonstrations in his behalf. These he was sorrowfully obliged to turn away. And it may well be believed that after the wonderful vital world revelation so suddenly made to Pierre at the Meadows, a revelation which, at moments, in some certain things, fairly timonized him, he had not failed to clutch with peculiar nervous detestation and contempt that ample parcel containing the letters of his biographico and other silly correspondence, which, in a less ferocious hour, he had filed away as curiosities. It was with an almost infernal grin that he saw that particular heap of rubbish eternally quenched in the fire, and felt that as it was consumed before his eyes, so in his soul was forever killed the last and minutest undeveloped microscopic germ of that most despicable vanity to which those absurd correspondents thought to appeal. Book 18. Pierre, as a Juvenile author, reconsidered by Herman Melville. Inasmuch as by various indirect intimations much more than ordinary natural genius has been imputed to Pierre, it may have seemed an inconsistency that only the merest magazine papers should have been thus far the sole productions of his mind. Nor need it be added that, in the soberest earnest, those papers contained nothing uncommon. Indeed, entirely now to drop all irony, if hitherto anything like that has been indulged in, those fugitive things of Master Pierre's were the veriest commonplace. It is true, as I long before said, that nature at Saddle Meadows had very early been as a benediction to Pierre, had blown her wind clarion to him from the blue hills, and murmured melodious secrecies to him by her streams and her woods. But while nature thus very early and very abundantly feeds us, she is very late in tutoring us as to the proper methodization of our diet. Or, to change the metaphor, there are immense quarries of fine marble, but how to get it out, how to chisel it, how to construct any temple? Youth must wholly quit, then, the quarry for a while, and not only go forth and get tools to use in the quarry, but must go and thoroughly study architecture. Now the quarry discoverer is long before the stone cutter, and the stone cutter is long before the architect, and the architect is long before the temple, for the temple is the crown of the world. Yes, Pierre was not only very unarchitectural at that time, but Pierre was very young, indeed, at that time. And it is often to be observed that as in digging for precious metals in the mines, much earthy rubbish has first to be troublesomely handled and thrown out, so, in digging in one's soul for the fine gold of genius, much dullness and commonplace is first brought to light. Happy would it be if the man possessed in himself some receptacle for his own rubbish of this sort, but he is like the occupant of a dwelling, whose refuse cannot be clapped into his own cellar, but must be deposited in the street before his own door, for the public functionaries to take care of. No commonplace is ever effectually got rid of, except by essentially emptying oneself of it into a book, for once trapped in a book, then the book can be put into the fire and all will be well. But they are not always put into the fire, and this accounts for the vast majority of miserable books over those of positive merit. Nor will any thoroughly sincere man, who is an author, ever be rash in precisely defining the period when he has completely ridded himself of his rubbish and come to the latent gold in his mine. It holds true, in every case, that the wiser a man is, the more misgivings he has on certain points. It is well enough known that the best productions of the best human intellects are generally regarded by those intellects as mere immature freshman exercises, wholly worthless in themselves, except as initiatives for entering the great university of God after death. Certain it is that if any inferences can be drawn from observations of the familiar lives of men of the greatest mark, their finest things, those which become the foolish glory of the world, are not only very poor and inconsiderable to themselves, but often positively distasteful. They would rather not have the book in the room. In minds comparatively inferior as compared with the above, these surmising considerations so sadden and unfit that they become careless of what they write, go to their desks with discontent, and only remain there, victims to headache and pain in the back, by the hard constraint of some social necessity. Equally paltry and despicable to them are the works thus composed, born of unwillingness and the bill of the baker, the rickety offspring of a parent, careless of life herself and reckless of the germ life she contains. Let not the short-sighted world for a moment imagine that any vanity lurks in such minds, only hired to appear on the stage, not voluntarily claiming the public attention. Their utmost life-redness and glow is but rouge, washed off in private with bitterest tears. Their laugh only rings because it is hollow, and the answering laugh is no laughter to them. There is nothing so slipperily alluring as sadness. We become sad in the first place by having nothing stirring to do. We continue in it because we have found a snug sofa at last. Even so, it may possibly be that arrived at this quiet retrospective little episode in the career of my hero, this shallowly expansive embayed tapansy of my otherwise deep Hetty Hudson, I too begin to loungingly expand and wax harmlessly sad and sentimental. Now, what has been hitherto presented in reference to Pierre, concerning rubbish, as in some cases the unavoidable first-fruits of genius, is in no wise contradicted by the fact that the first published works of many meritorious authors have given mature token of genius, for we do not know how many they previously published to the flames, or privately published in their own brains, and suppressed there as quickly. And in the inferior instances of an immediate literary success, in very young writers, it will be almost invariably observable that for that instant success they were chiefly indebted to some rich and peculiar experience in life, embodied in a book, which because, for that cause, containing original matter, the author himself, forsooth, is to be considered original. In this way, many very original books, being the product of very unoriginal minds. Indeed, man has only to be but a little circumspect, and away flies the last rag of his vanity. The world is forever babbling of originality, but there never yet was an original man, in the sense intended by the world, the first man himself, who according to the rabbins was also the first author, not being an original, the only original author being God. Had Milton's been the lot of Caspar Hauser, Milton would have been vacant as he. For though the naked soul of man doth assuredly contain one latent element of intellectual productiveness, yet never was there a child born solely from one parent, the visible world of experience being that procreative thing which impregnates the muses, self-reciprocally efficient hermaphrodites being but a fable. There is infinite nonsense in the world on all of these matters, hence blame me not if I contribute my mite. It is impossible to talk or to write without apparently throwing oneself helplessly open. The invulnerable knight wears his visor down. Still, it is pleasant to chat, for it passes the time ere we go to our beds, and speech is farther incited, when like strolling improvisations of Italy, we are paid for our breath, and we are only too thankful when the gapes of the audience dismiss us with the few ducats we earn. Chapter 2. It may have been already inferred that the pecuniary plans of Pierre touching his independent means of support in the city were based upon his presumed literary capabilities. For what else could he do? He knew no profession, no trade. Glad now perhaps might he have been, if fate had made him a blacksmith, and not a gentleman, a Glendinning, and a genius. But here he would have been unpardonably rash, had he not already, in some degree, actually tested the fact, in his own personal experience, that it is not altogether impossible for a magazine contributor to juvenile American literature to receive a few pence in exchange for his ditties. Such cases stand upon imperishable record, and it were both folly and ingratitude to disown them. But since the fine social position and noble patrimony of Pierre had thus far rendered it altogether unnecessary for him to earn the least farthing of his own in the world, whether by hand or by brain, it may seem desirable to explain a little here as we go. We shall do so, but always including the preamble. Sometimes every possible maxim or thought seems an old one, yet it is among the elder of the things in that unaugmentable stock that never mind what one's situation may be, however prosperous and happy, he will still be impatient of it. He will still reach out of himself and beyond every present condition. So, while many a poor being to galley slave, toiling with the heavy oar of a quill, to gain something wherewithal to stave off the cravings of nature, and in his hours of morbid self-reproach, regarding his paltry wages, at all events, as an unavoidable disgrace to him, while this galley slave of letters would have leaped with delight, reckless of the feeble seams of his pantaloons, at the most distant prospect of inheriting the broad farms of Saddle Meadows, lord of an all-sufficing income, and forever exempt from wearing on his hands those treacherous plague spots of indigence, videlicet, blots from the inkstand. Pierre himself, the undoubted and actual possessor of the things only longingly and hopelessly imagined by the other, the then top of Pierre's worldly ambition, was the being able to boast that he had written such matters as publishers would pay something for in the way of a mere business transaction, which they thought would prove profitable. Yet altogether weak and silly as this may seem in Pierre, let us preambilically examine a little further, and see if it be so indeed. Pierre was proud, and a proud man, proud with the sort of pride now meant, ever holds but lightly those things, however beneficent, which he did not for himself procure. Were such pride carried out to its legitimate end, the man would eat no bread, the seeds whereof he had not himself put into the soil, not entirely without humiliation, that even that seed must be borrowed from some previous planter. A proud man likes to feel himself in himself, and not by reflection in others. He likes to be not only his own alpha and omega, but to be distinctly all the intermediate gradations, and then to slope off on his own spine either way, into the endless impalpable ether. What a glory it was then to Pierre, when first in his two gentlemanly hands he jingled the wages of labor. Talk of drums and the fife. The echo of coin of one's own earning is more inspiring than all the trumpets of Sparta. How disdainfully now he eyed the sumptuousness of his hereditary halls, the hangings and the pictures, and the bragging historic armorials, and the banners of the Glendinning renown, confident that if need should come, he would not be forced to turn resurrectionist, and dig up his grandfather's Indian chief grave for the ancestral sword and shield, ignominiously to pawn them for a living. He could live on himself. Oh, twice blessed now, in the feeling of practical capacity, was Pierre. The mechanic, the day laborer, has but one way to live. His body must provide for his body. But not only could Pierre in some sort do that, he could do the other, and letting his body stay lazily at home, send off his soul to labor, and his soul would come faithfully back and pay his body her wages. So, some unprofessional gentlemen of the aristocratic South, who happened to own slaves, give those slaves liberty to go and seek work, and every night return with their wages, which constitute those idle gentlemen's income. Both ambidexter and quadruple-armed is that man, who in a day laborer's body possesses a day-laboring soul. Yet let not such an one be overconfident. Our God is a jealous God. He wills not that any man should permanently possess the least shadow of his own self-sufficient attributes. Yoke the body to the soul, and put both to the plough, and the one or the other must in the end assuredly drop in the furrow. Keep, then, thy body effeminate for labor, and thy soul laboriously robust, or else thy soul effeminate for labor, and thy body laboriously robust. Elect. The two will not lastingly abide in one yoke. Thus over the most vigorous and soaring conceits doth the cloud of truth come stealing. Thus doth the shot, even of a 62-pounder pointed upward, light at last on the earth, for strive we how we may, we cannot overshoot the earth's orbit to receive the attractions of other planets. Earth's law of gravitation extends far beyond her own atmosphere. In the operative opinion of this world, he who is already fully provided with what is necessary for him, that man shall have more, while he who is deplorably destitute of the same, he shall have taken away from him even that which he hath. Yet the world vows it is a very plain, downright matter-of-fact, plodding, humane sort of world. It is governed only by the simplest principles, and scorns all ambiguities, all transcendentals, and all manner of juggling. Now, some imaginatively heterodoxical men are often surprisingly twit upon their willful inverting of all common-sense notions, their absurd and all-displacing transcendentals, which say 3 is 4, and 2 make 10. But if the eminent Jugglarius himself ever advocated in mere words a doctrine 1,000th part so ridiculous and subversive of all practical sense, as that doctrine which the world actually and eternally practices, of giving unto him who already hath more than enough, still more of the superfluous article, and taking away from him who hath nothing at all, even that which he hath, then is the truest book in the world a lie. Wherefore we see that the so-called transcendentalists are not the only people who deal in transcendentals. On the contrary, we seem to see that the utilitarians, the everyday world's people themselves, far transcend those inferior transcendentalists by their own incomprehensible worldly maxims. And, what is vastly more, with the one party, their transcendentals are but theoretic and inactive, and therefore harmless, whereas with the other, they are actually clothed in living deeds. The highly groveling doctrine and practice of the world, above cited, had in some small degree been manifested in the case of Pierre. He prospectively possessed the fee of several hundred farms scattered over part of 2 adjoining counties, and now the proprietor of that popular periodical, the Gazelle magazine, sent him several additional dollars for his sonnets. That proprietor, though in sooth he never read the sonnets, but referred them to his professional adviser, and was so ignorant that, for a long time previous to the periodical's actually being started, he insisted upon spelling the Gazelle with a G for the Z, as thus, Gagelle, maintaining that in the Gazelle connection, the Z was a mere impostor, and that the G was soft, for he was a judge of softness, and could speak from experience. That proprietor was undoubtedly a transcendentalist, for did he not act upon the transcendental doctrine previously set forth? Now, the dollars derived from his ditties, these Pierre had always invested in cigars, so that the puffs which indirectly brought him his dollars were again returned, but as perfumed puffs, perfumed with the sweet leaf of Havana. So that this highly celebrated and world-renowned Pierre, the great author, whose likeness the world had never seen, for had he not repeatedly refused the world his likeness, this famous poet and philosopher, author of The Tropical Summer, a sonnet, against whose very life several desperadoes were darkly plotting, for had not the biographers sworn they would have it, this towering celebrity, there he would sit smoking, and smoking, mild and self-festooned as a vapory mountain. It was very involuntarily and satisfactorily reciprocal. His cigars were lighted in 2 ways, lighted by the sale of his sonnets, and lighted by the printed sonnets themselves. For even at that early time in his authorial life, Pierre, however vain of his fame, was not at all proud of his paper. Not only did he make allumettes of his sonnets when published, but was very careless about his discarded manuscripts. They were to be found lying all round the house, gave a great deal of trouble to the housemaids in sweeping, went for kindlings to the fires, and were forever flitting out of the windows and under the door-sills, into the faces of people passing the manorial mansion. In this reckless, indifferent way of his, Pierre himself was a sort of publisher. It is true his more familiar admirers often earnestly remonstrated with him against this irreverence to the primitive vestments of his immortal productions, saying that whatever had once felt the nib of his mighty pen was thenceforth sacred as the lips which had but once saluted the great toe of the Pope. But hardened as he was to these friendly censurings, Pierre never forbade that ardent appreciation of the Tier, who, finding a small fragment of the original manuscript containing a Tier over an I, esteemed the significant event providential, and begged the distinguished favor of being permitted to have it for a brooch, and ousted a cameo head of Homer to replace it with the more invaluable gem. He became inconsolable when, being caught in a rain, Tier disappeared from over the I, so that the strangeness and wonderfulness of the sonnet was still conspicuous, in that though the least fragment of it could weep in a drought, yet did it become all tearless in a shower. But this indifferent and supercilious amateur, deaf to the admiration of the world, the enigmatically merry and renowned author of the Tier, the pride of the Gazelle magazine, on whose flaunting cover his name figured at the head of all contributors, no small men either, for their lives had all been fraternally written by each other, and they had clubbed and had their likenesses all taken by the aggregate job and published on paper, all bought at one shop. This high-prestiged Pierre, whose future popularity and voluminousness had become so startlingly announced by what he had already written, that certain speculators came to the meadows to survey its water power, if any, with a view to start a paper mill expressly for the great author and so monopolize his stationery dealings. This vast being, spoken of with awe by all merely youthful aspirants for fame, this age-neutralizing Pierre, before whom an old gentleman of 65, formerly librarian to Congress, on being introduced to him at the magazine publishers, devoutly took off his hat and kept it so, and remained standing, though Pierre was socially seated with his hat on. This wonderful, disdainful genius, but only life amateur as yet, is now soon to appear in a far different guise. He shall now learn, and very bitterly learn, that though the world worship mediocrity and commonplace, yet hath it fire and sword for all contemporary grandeur, that though it swears that it fiercely assails all hypocrisy, yet hath it not always an ear for earnestness. And though this state of things, united with the ever-multiplying freshets of new books, seems inevitably to point to a coming time, when the mass of humanity reduced to one level of dotage, authors shall be scarce as alchemists are today, and the printing press be reckoned a small invention. Yet even now, in the foretaste of this let us hug ourselves, oh, my Aurelian, that though the age of authors be passing, the hours of earnestness shall remain. Dear listener, we close the pages on another tale, a journey through words, imagination, and emotion. Here at the Falls Audiobook, where stories flow like a river's current, carrying you to distant worlds and uncharted depths, we thank you for joining us. As always, we invite you to linger a little longer. Subscribe to our channel to discover more stories waiting to be heard, each a cascade of voices, ideas, and artistry. And remember, every great story begins with a single word. Perhaps the next one will begin with you. Until our voices meet again, may your days be filled with quiet moments, rich pages, and the soothing sound of a story well told. This is the Falls Audiobook, signing off.